Imagine pulling out a single folded piece of paper from inside a crumbling wall and watching an entire dynasty collapse because of what was written on it. That is not a metaphor, that is exactly what happened. And by the time this story is over, you are going to understand why some secrets are buried inside walls instead of burned, and why the people who put them there knew exactly what they were doing. Stay with me, because this one goes places you are not expecting. Welcome to the Fear Sermon, the place where history's darkest, most carefully hidden stories finally get to breathe. If you are new here, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications, because we drop stories like this regularly and you do not want to miss a single one. And if you have been here before, you already know we do not do surface level. We go all the way down. Now, let us talk about the Aldermane family. In the late 1800s, somewhere in the rolling countryside of rural England, there existed a family so powerful, so deeply embedded in the social, political, and financial fabric of their region, that people simply referred to them as the family, not the Aldermanes, just the family, as if no other family in the county mattered enough to need a name. Their estate, Wrenfield Hall, sat on over 400 acres of land. It had been in the family for 6 generations. The main house had 31 rooms, a private chapel, a stable block that rivaled most public facilities of the time, and walls, thick stone walls that had been built, rebuilt, extended, and repaired across 2.5 centuries of Aldermane occupation. Those walls had absorbed a great deal. Rain, wind, the sounds of celebration, the sounds of grief, the sounds of things that were never meant to leave the building. But as it turned out, one of those walls had absorbed something else entirely, a secret. Pressed flat, folded carefully, tucked behind a loose stone panel in what had once been a servant's anteroom, a letter. A letter that no one was supposed to find, and for nearly 40 years no one did. The discovery happened in 1923. Wrenfield Hall was undergoing renovations for the first time in decades. The Aldermane family, now in its 7th generation under the leadership of a man named Edmund Aldermane, had fallen on harder times than their ancestors would have tolerated. The First World War had taken 2 of Edmund's brothers. The estate taxes introduced by the Liberal government had been quietly bleeding the family finances for years. And the sprawling house, grand as it still appeared from the outside, was beginning to deteriorate from within. Damp had crept into the eastern wing. A section of the roof above the drawing room had partially collapsed during a particularly brutal winter storm, and several interior walls had developed cracks that the estate manager described in his notes as structurally concerning. A local construction firm was brought in. Their job was to stabilize, repair, and in some areas completely rebuild sections of the interior walls. It was unglamorous work, dusty and slow. Most of the men doing it were practical, uncurious types who had no particular interest in the history of the building they were patching up. But one of them, a younger man named Thomas Greaves, who worked as an apprentice to the head mason, had a habit of pausing when he found unusual things inside walls. Old coins, animal bones, bits of fabric. He had a collector's instinct, or maybe just a curious nature. Either way, when his chisel struck something in the wall of the old anteroom that felt different, not stone, not plaster, but paper, he stopped. He reached in carefully, and he pulled out a folded envelope. The envelope was yellowed and fragile, sealed originally with dark red wax, though the seal had long since cracked and given up its grip. The letter inside was still legible. The ink had faded to a pale brown in some places, darkened to near black in others, but the words, the specific, devastating, carefully chosen words, were entirely readable. Thomas Greaves, to his credit, did not open it casually or dismiss it as unimportant. Something about the feel of it, the deliberateness of where it had been hidden, told him this mattered. He wrapped it in a cloth, put it in his coat pocket, and that evening brought it to the estate manager. The estate manager's name was Harold Finch. He had worked at Wrenfield Hall for 11 years, and considered himself a loyal servant of the Aldermane family in the old-fashioned sense, someone whose professional identity was genuinely tied to the well-being of the household he served. He read the letter that evening, alone in his small office near the kitchen block, and according to his own diary, which survived and was later examined by a local historian named Patricia Drummond in the 1970s, Harold Finch sat in complete silence for nearly an hour after reading it. Then he wrote in his diary, "I now understand certain things which I had previously attributed to coincidence or misfortune. The letter explains them. God help this family. So what was in the letter? Let us slow down here, because this is the part that requires context. To understand why the letter was so destructive, you need to understand what the Aldermane family had built their reputation on. Because powerful families in that era and in that class did not simply inherit money and land. They inherited a story, a carefully constructed, carefully maintained narrative about who they were, where they came from, and why they deserved to occupy the position they occupied. The story the Aldermanes told through their portraits, their family records, their memberships in exclusive clubs, their marriages into other powerful families, was one of noble origin, honest accumulation, and unbroken legitimate succession. They were old money, real money, the kind of family that did not need to explain itself because its legitimacy was simply understood. That story was a lie, not a small, convenient lie, not the kind of minor exaggeration that most old families engage in when their histories get a little complicated. A fundamental, structural lie. A lie that had been deliberately constructed in the 1840s by a man named William Aldermane, Edmund's great-grandfather, and then protected with extraordinary care by every generation that followed him. The letter, written in 1881 by a man named George Holt, was the written record of that lie. And George Holt had hidden it in the wall, not as an act of exposure, but as an act of protection for himself. George Holt had been William Aldermane's business partner in the 1840s. Together, they had built the original foundation of the Aldermane fortune through a series of land deals in the industrial north of England. At the time, the Industrial Revolution was creating enormous wealth, but it was also creating enormous chaos, displacing communities, forcing people off land their families had farmed for generations, creating legal ambiguities that sharp men with sharp lawyers could exploit. William Aldermane was one of those sharp men, and the deals he made were not simply aggressive or legally questionable. According to George Holt's letter, at least 3 of them were outright fraudulent. Forged documents, falsified surveys, bribes paid to local officials to look the other way while communities were cleared and land was absorbed into what would eventually become the Aldermane estate. But that was not the worst of it. The worst of it was what William Aldermane had done to become William Aldermane in the first place. Because that was not his name. George Holt's letter revealed that the man who had built Wrenfield Hall, who had purchased the title that the family later parlayed into social respectability, who had constructed the entire mythology of Aldermane heritage, was born William Crabtree, the illegitimate son of a mill worker in Lancashire. He had no noble blood. He had no family history worth speaking of. He had arrived in the world with nothing except intelligence, ambition, and a complete willingness to become whoever he needed to become. In the 1840s, when he was in his early 30s and the money was starting to come in, he had paid handsomely, according to Holt, for an entirely fabricated identity, forged birth records, manufactured lineage documents, a story about a distant branch of a real but obscure aristocratic family that had conveniently died out, leaving no one to contradict the claim. He had become William Aldermane, gentlemen, and from that moment forward had played the role with such conviction that by the time he died in 1887, the lie had become indistinguishable from truth. George Holt had known all of this. He had been there for much of it, and for decades he had kept the secret, partly out of loyalty, partly out of the fact that his own financial success was entangled with William's, and partly The letter is quite clear about this. Out of genuine affection for the man he had watched construct himself from nothing, William Crabtree becoming William Aldermane had been, in Holt's words, one of the most extraordinary acts of human will he had ever witnessed. He had not wanted to destroy it, but something had changed in 1881. That was the year that William Aldermane, by then elderly and in declining health, had made a decision that George Holt considered a profound betrayal. The details of that betrayal are somewhat obscured in the letter. Holt writes around them rather than directly stating them, which historians have noted suggests he may have been concerned about the letter being read by the wrong person even as he was writing it, but the outline is clear enough. William had made a financial arrangement that effectively cut Holt out of what Holt considered his rightful share of their jointly accumulated assets. There had been a disagreement, legal threats had been made, and William, secure in his fabricated identity and his established social position, had simply refused to take Holt seriously. He had, according to the letter, told Holt that no one would believe the word of a common tradesman over a gentleman of his standing. That had been a mistake, because George Holt was not simply going to sue and lose. He was not simply going to write an angry letter and send it. He was going to write the letter, the complete, detailed, documented account of everything he knew, and then hide it somewhere that it would survive long after both of them were dead. Not to destroy the family, not yet, anyway, but as what he explicitly called in the letter his insurance against further injustice. He had apparently also made William Aldermane aware that the letter existed and that its location would be revealed to the appropriate authorities should anything happen to Holt or his own family. It was, in the language of a later age, mutually assured destruction. Whatever financial dispute had sparked the crisis appears to have been resolved, because George Holt lived out the rest of his life in relative comfort, and William Aldermane died 6 years later, without the letter ever surfacing. Then Holt himself died in 1899, and apparently either forgot to arrange for the letter's retrieval or deliberately chose to leave it where it was, perhaps as a final act of control, perhaps simply because old men sometimes let things go. The wall kept the secret, the family continued, and nobody knew. Until Thomas Greaves's chisel found it. Harold Finch, the estate manager, faced a decision that must have kept him awake for several nights. He was a loyal employee of the Aldermane family. He also knew, as anyone familiar with the legal and social landscape of 1920s England would know, that the contents of this letter, if they became public, would be catastrophic. Not just embarrassing, not just socially damaging, potentially criminal if anyone chose to pursue the fraud element of the land deals. And certainly ruinous in terms of the family's social standing, their marriages, their financial relationships, and the dozens of smaller arrangements and understandings that a family like Aldermane's maintained through the implicit assumption of their legitimacy. He made a choice that was, in some ways, the most human choice possible. He told Edmund. He brought the letter to Edmund Aldermane directly, without making a copy, without telling anyone else what it contained. He sat in the great man's study, though by 1923 the great man was tired and thin, and the study smelled of damp, and he put the letter on the desk and waited while Edmund read it. What happened in that room is not recorded with certainty. Finch's diary entry for that day is sparse, just a few lines, notably more restrained than his usual writing, which suggests he was being careful. What is known is that Edmund Aldermane did not dismiss the letter as a forgery. He did not rage at Finch for bringing it to him. He asked for privacy. Finch left. And the next morning, Edmund Aldermane called together his solicitor, his eldest son Charles, and his younger brother Geoffrey, who had been living in London and was summoned by telegram. Whatever was said in that meeting, the effects became visible over the following months. The first thing that happened was that the renovations at Wrenfield Hall were quietly expanded to include a complete rebuilding of the anteroom wall. The letter, as far as anyone knew, was returned to Finch, who kept it. There is a line in his diary several months later that reads simply, "I have done what I was asked." No one will find it again. Whether this means the letter was destroyed, buried again somewhere else, or sent elsewhere for safekeeping remains unknown. It was never found a second time. The second thing that happened was more visible and more consequential. Charles Aldermane, Edmund's eldest son, and the presumed heir to whatever remained of the family's legacy, quietly began a process of asset liquidation that had not been publicly discussed. Property was sold, investments were wound down. A particular portfolio of rural landholdings in the north of England, lands that, if Holt's account was accurate, had been acquired through the fraudulent deals of the 1840s, was sold off almost entirely within 18 months. The sales were explained at the time as financial necessity, which, given the state of the family finances, was not untrue. But the specific selection of properties sold, and the speed with which they were disposed of, suggests to later historians that someone had made the decision to put as much distance as possible between the current family and the most legally questionable elements of their inheritance. The third thing was harder to trace but perhaps most telling. The family began to withdraw, not dramatically, not in the way that would invite attention or speculation. But invitations declined, memberships lapsed. Social engagements that had been reliably attended for decades were quietly stopped attending. Edmund Aldermane, who had been a regular presence at the local magistrate's bench, retired from that position on grounds of health. Charles, who had been positioned for a career in politics, which in those days required exactly the kind of impeccable lineage claim that the family could no longer be entirely confident about, redirected his ambitions toward business instead. The family stopped putting itself in positions where its history might be scrutinized. Patricia Drummond, the historian who pieced much of this together in the 1970s using Harold Finch's diary and local records, described it as a controlled demolition. The family did not collapse. It did not face a public scandal. It did not see its members prosecuted or its name dragged through the newspapers. What happened instead was quieter and in some ways more complete. The Aldermanes simply stopped being the Aldermanes in the old sense. They shed the public identity their ancestor had constructed, retreated from the social positions that identity had purchased, and reconstituted themselves as something more modest. By the 1940s, Wrenfield Hall had been sold. The family had dispersed. The name still existed in various parts of England, carried by descendants who in most cases knew very little about the specific details of what their ancestor had done or what a single hidden letter had set in motion. But here is the part that really deserves to sit with you for a moment. George Holt never wanted public exposure. The letter was never meant as a weapon of mass destruction, aimed at an entire family across multiple generations. It was a personal insurance policy, written by a man who felt wronged and wanted leverage. It was a document of private grievance that happened to contain the evidence of something much larger than any private grievance. Holt wrote it, hid it, presumably told William where it was, achieved whatever resolution he was after, and then, either by accident or design, left it to be found by strangers in a future he would never see. And William Aldermane, the man who had built his entire life on the premise that reinvention was possible if you were bold enough to commit to it fully, made one critical error. He dismissed George Holt as someone beneath him, someone whose word would not be believed. He underestimated the power of a written document, carefully hidden, waiting with the patience that only inanimate objects possess. Paper does not get old the way people do. It does not lose its memory. It does not get tired of waiting. The wall kept the secret for 40 years, and when the wall finally gave it up, it did not matter that both William and George had been dead for decades. It did not matter that the original dispute between them had been settled. The letter said what it said, and what it said could not be unsaid. Think for a moment about the strange intimacy of a hidden letter. When you write something and seal it, and put it somewhere you think no one will find it. You are doing something psychologically interesting. You are preserving the moment. You are giving permanence to something you might otherwise have let fade. A feeling, a fact, a truth that you felt needed to exist somewhere outside your own head. George Holt wrote that letter in 1881 and tucked it inside a wall, and in some sense it stayed 1881 inside that wall. The anger was still fresh, the betrayal was still vivid, the details were still precise. And when Thomas Greaves's chisel found it in 1923, all of that preserved intact 40-year-old truth came pouring out into a world that had completely moved on, into a family that had spent those 40 years building on top of a foundation they thought was safely buried. That is the nature of things hidden rather than resolved. This is something that shows up repeatedly in history, not just in grand family sagas, but in ordinary lives. Things that are concealed rather than confronted have a way of surviving longer than anyone intended. Documents, objects, confessions written and then hidden, stories told to one person and then carried forward, transforming and mutating but never entirely disappearing. Human beings are remarkably poor at making things truly disappear. We hide things in walls and attics and locked boxes and the backs of drawers. We hide them in half, truths told to children about where the family money came from. We hide them in documents that we think no one will ever find because we are thinking about the world as it is right now, not the world as it will be when some stranger with a chisel is patching up a wall 40 years from now. William Crabtree, who became William Aldermane, was a brilliant man by any measure. The audacity required to completely reinvent your identity, forge a lineage, purchase a social position, and then inhabit it so convincingly that your children and grandchildren grew up believing the story is truth that is not the work of an ordinary mind. That is a sustained, decades-long performance of self-creation that most people cannot even imagine attempting. In another era, under other circumstances, his story might have been celebrated as a testament to human adaptability. The self-made man in the most radical possible sense, but the fraud was real. The communities displaced by his land deals were real. The families whose histories were distorted by his manufactured lineage, including his own, were real. And George Holt, sitting in his study in 1881, knew all of it and wrote it down with the calm clarity of a man who had decided that truth, at minimum, deserved to exist somewhere. What Patricia Drummond found when she researched this story in the 1970s was that several of the families displaced by the Northern land deals in the 1840s had been telling their own version of story for generations. Not the full story. They did not know about William Crabtree's fabricated identity or George Holt's letter. But they knew that something had not been right about the way the land had changed hands. They had records of their own. Incomplete, partial records, but records. And Drummond was struck by the fact that the displacement these families had experienced had shaped their trajectories for generations, not in the dramatic, catastrophic way that the Aldermane family's unraveling had shaped theirs, but in the quieter, more grinding way that loss of land and economic security shapes families across time. The fraud of the 1840s had rippled outward in two directions simultaneously. It had elevated one family on the basis of something stolen, and it had depressed others on the basis of something taken. Both sets of consequences were still visible a century later. There is something in that symmetry that I find genuinely worth sitting with. The Aldermane story is often told, when it is told at all, which is not frequently, because it is a local history rather than a famous one, as a story about secrets, about the danger of things hidden, about the fragility of constructed identities, and it is all of those things. But it is also a story about consequences that outlast their causes. William Crabtree did what he did in the 1840s. George Holt wrote what he wrote in 1881. Thomas Greaves found what he found in 1923. Patricia Drummond traced what she traced in the 1970s. And at every point in that chain, the consequences of decisions made by people who were long dead were still actively shaping the present of people who were very much alive. The displaced families were still displaced. The Aldermane family was still Aldermane, still carrying a name that had been invented, still living within a story that had originated as deliberate fiction. That continuity is not unique to this story. It is the normal condition of history. We are all in various ways living in houses built by people we never met, whose decisions we did not make, whose mistakes and triumphs and frauds and generosities have flowed forward through time to become the circumstances we inhabit. The difference in the Aldermane case is the letter, the physical, tangible, written evidence that made the invisible chain of causation suddenly visible. That collapsed the comfortable distance between past and present. That made it impossible for the people in that study in 1923 to pretend that what happened in the 1840s was simply history. Let us also spend a moment with Harold Finch, because I think he deserves it. Here was a man whose job was to manage an estate, to keep things running, to be loyal. And suddenly he was sitting in his small office holding a document that had the power to end the world he had built his professional life around. He did not leak it. He did not sell it to a newspaper. He did not use it as leverage for himself. He brought it directly to Edmund and then, by his own diary account, did exactly what he was asked to do with it, whatever that was, and kept the secret for the rest of his life. He was in his 50s in 1923, and he died in 1941, 18 years of carrying the knowledge. His diary never refers to it again after that one sparse entry, which is itself a kind of eloquence. Some things, when they are truly too heavy, stop being written about. They just get carried. Thomas Greaves, the young mason who found the letter, was apparently told only that it was a private family document that had been accidentally sealed in the wall during an earlier renovation. He was given a small sum of money for his discretion, which in 1923 England was a sufficiently normal transaction that it apparently did not strike him as suspicious, and the matter was closed as far as he was concerned. He later told a grandchild about finding an old envelope in a wall at a big house once, but described it as uninteresting. He had no idea. Most people who handle the instruments of history have no idea. Now, one of the things that makes this story particularly resonant for those who have studied it is what happened not just to the Aldermane family, but to their story, the narrative, the constructed mythology, the family history that William Crabtree had manufactured so carefully, because that story did not simply disappear when the family withdrew from public life. It persisted in the historical record. It was referenced in local histories. It appeared in the memoirs of people who had known the family socially. It was repeated in the kind of casual, confident way that established facts get repeated when no one has any particular reason to question them. The lie had become historical record. And even after Drummond's research in the 1970s, which was published in a limited academic context and never reached a wide audience, the manufactured version of the Aldermane family history continued to appear in certain sources. This is one of the things that happens when the truth arrives late. By the time George Holt's letter did its damage, the lie it exposed had been circulating for 80 years. It had been incorporated into other histories. It had been used as a reference point by other researchers. Correcting it required not just finding the truth, but actively tracing all the places the lie had already reached and doing the patient, unglamorous work of correction. Some of those corrections were never made. In some local histories, if you look carefully enough, you can still find the Aldermane family described in terms that William Crabtree would have recognized and approved of, developing not only as a flavor, but the goal that the line This brings us to something that I think is worth saying directly. The story of Wrenfield Hall and the Aldermane family is not simply a historical curiosity or a Gothic tale about old English estates and buried secrets. It is a story about the architecture of power, about how power is built and how it is maintained, not primarily through force but through narrative. The Aldermanes were powerful, not because they were strong in any physical sense. They were powerful because everyone around them believed a story. Believed it so thoroughly that they organized their behavior around it, deferring to the family, doing business with the family on favorable terms, treating the family as a legitimate authority in local affairs. The power was real, but its foundation was fiction. And the fiction was maintained not through active deception on the part of each new generation, most of whom genuinely did not know, but through the simple inertia of an established story. That is how a lot of power actually works. And the corollary of that is what we see in this story. When the foundation of the narrative becomes vulnerable, when a document exists that can disprove the story, the power becomes fragile in a way it was not before. Not because the document has changed anything materially. Edmund Aldermane in 1923 was the same man he had been before Harold Finch put that letter on his desk. The family's land was the same land. Their house was the same house. Their money was whatever it was. But the story had changed. The story that gave all of those material things their meaning, their legitimacy, their social weight had changed. And without the story, the material things turned out to be insufficient to maintain the position. There is a reason why, across history, the powerful have consistently sought to control the narrative as much as they have sought to control the land or the money. The Aldermane story illustrates that with unusual clarity because it shows us both the construction and the unraveling. We can trace with reasonable precision the moment when the story was built. We can trace with equal precision the moment when it became vulnerable. And we can watch, through Harold Finch's diary and local records and Patricia Drummond's careful research, the way the family responded when the vulnerability became undeniable. They did not fight, they withdrew. That choice deserves consideration. Edmund Aldermane could, in theory, have chosen a different response. He could have dismissed the letter as an obvious forgery, and it is not clear, given the state of documentary evidence from the 1840s, that he would necessarily have lost that argument. He could have taken the offensive, found ways to discredit George Holt posthumously, buried the implications under a sufficiently aggressive counter-narrative. He was not a weak man by the accounts that survive. He had managed the estate through genuinely difficult circumstances. He was not someone who typically avoided confrontation, but he did not fight. And I think the reason he did not fight is that he believed the letter. It rang true. Whatever stories had been passed down within the family, whatever partial truths or careful silences had accompanied the Aldermane inheritance, the letter apparently confirmed something that Edmund, on some level, recognized. He knew or suspected that the foundation was not what he had been told it was. And when the evidence arrived in physical form, he did not have the will to construct a defense of something he knew, in his heart, was not defensible. That quiet capitulation, the choice to dissolve rather than defend, is in many ways the most human moment in the whole story. It is the moment where the performance finally became too expensive, where maintaining the fiction required more energy than the man who had inherited it, but not created it, was able or willing to spend. What do we do with all of this? Patricia Drummond, in her account, ends with a question rather than a conclusion. She asks what it means that a family can be powerful for 3 generations on the basis of a lie, can cause real harm to real communities through that lie, can have the lie both exposed and contained, can withdraw from the consequences without fully facing them, and can then simply continue, dispersed, diminished, but not destroyed, carrying a name that was invented and a history that was manufactured, into a future that has largely forgotten both the lie and the harm it caused. She does not answer the question. She leaves it open, and I think she is right to do that, because there is no clean answer. There is no moment of complete justice in this story. The displaced families from the 1840s did not receive restitution. The fraudulent land deals were not officially acknowledged. The Aldermane name was not publicly disgraced. George Holt, who in his own complicated way was the instrument of whatever accountability the family faced, died having never seen the effect of his hidden letter. Thomas Greaves went to his grave not knowing what he had found. Harold Finch carried the knowledge for 18 years and apparently told no one. The letter destroyed a powerful family in the sense that it ended the particular form of power they had held, and the particular story that had sustained it. But the word destroyed might be too strong. What the letter actually did was more subtle and more unsettling. It forced a reckoning, a private, quiet, incompletely witnessed reckoning. It made the lie undeniable to the people who most needed to deny it. And in doing so, it removed their will to keep performing. That is not nothing, but it is also not justice in any complete sense of the word. And perhaps that is the most honest thing to take from this story. Not that secrets will always be exposed, many are not. Not that justice will always arrive, often it does not. But that truth, when it is written down and hidden rather than destroyed, has a kind of durability that the people who create it and the people who hide it tend to underestimate. George Holt put something true inside a wall and trusted the wall to hold it. The wall held it for 40 years, and when it finally let it go, the truth was as sharp and as specific and as functional as it had been the day it was written. Time had not softened it, distance had not diluted it, the people involved had died, but the facts had not died with them. The letter was not waiting, it did not have intentions, it was just paper and ink inside a stone wall. But the effect of its survival was something very close to patience. A patience that outlasted the man who created it, the man it was created against, the man who found it, and very nearly the institution it eventually helped to unmake. There is something in that which I think speaks to something deep in human experience. The sense that the things we try to bury have a tendency to surface. Not always, not reliably, not with any cosmic guarantee, but often enough and in surprising enough ways that the pattern becomes visible across history. The wall at Wrenfield Hall was solid stone. It was maintained and repaired across decades, and it still gave up what had been put inside it. This is the Fear Sermon, and if this story made you think, if it sent your mind in directions you were not expecting when you first clicked on it, then this channel is exactly where you need to be. We find the stories that most channels walk past. We sit with the ones that do not have clean endings. We ask the questions that the historical record leaves open, and we do it every week, right here. If you want more stories like this, stories about hidden letters and buried secrets, and the way the past continues to press against the present in ways we do not always recognize until a chisel hits something that was never meant to be found, subscribe right now. The button is right there. It takes 2 seconds. And once you are subscribed, you will not have to wonder if you are missing something, because you will not be. Before you go, though, I want to ask you something genuinely, down in the comments. What do you think Harold Finch should have done? When he sat in that office with that letter and understood what it contained, what was the right thing to do? Take it to Edmund, make it public, destroy it, keep it for himself? There is no obvious answer, and I want to know what you actually think. Leave it in the comments. I read them. I respond when I can. And the best comments in these threads always make the experience better for everyone who comes after you. And if this story hit you, if you found yourself thinking about it in a way you did not expect, share it. Send it to one person who you think would find it interesting. That is how these stories travel. That is how the things that deserve to be remembered actually get remembered. Not because an algorithm decides they matter, but because people who found them meaningful pass them on to someone else who might feel the same way. Be that person, share this one. The wall kept its secret for 40 years. You do not have to keep this story to yourself for even 40 seconds.